Campbell Newman, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast. As I was saying just before we got on, part of the reason why I've set up these interviews is because I've been a little bit sort of frustrated with the discussion in Australia, especially on the centre right. It either sort of becomes one of two things. We either get the kind of nighttime whack-a-woke on Sky News where everyone is sort of in violent agreement on many of the issues, or else we get, to the extent it even exists, we get the sort of long-form Annabelle Crabb or Four Corners profiles of political people on the centre right. And you might find out some interesting things. You know they're never really your friends. And I do think there needs to be a bit more kind of discussion on the centre right, because there are a lot of, there's been a reassessment globally about some of the sort of bipartisan consensus that existed in the 80s. It was formed there. Certainly there's been a big reassessment in the United States.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's been enough of that here. So brief intro to you, but you can kind of add anything else. Campbell Newman, for those who don't know, was former Premier of Queensland, former Mayor of Brisbane, our capital city, which I think is unique, right? I don't believe there are any other people that have both served as Mayor of the capital city and as Premier of the state. Is that right?
Not here in Queensland, Dan. I can't think of anybody. There's certainly a former Lord Mayor, William Jolly, who ended up serving in the federal parliament as a backbencher. Yeah, but that's about the only one I can really think of.
Yeah, and so it's always interesting to go into people's early life, because I think you find out a lot more about that way. Your parents, the late Kevin Newman and Jocelyn Newman, both served as ministers in the Fraser and Howard government, respectively, and originally from Tasmania. And I remember when we had a chat a while back, you mentioned that actually they voted for Whitlam in 1972 before they got sick of it all. Why do you think they did that at the time? What was attractive about the Whitlam policy program that they thought they could vote for?
Well, probably a bit of a snapshot about my parents as well. So, my mum was from Melbourne and trained as a lawyer, went to Melbourne University, and my dad came from Sydney and went to the Royal Military College, Duntroon, as I did 30 years later. And when the 1972 election was on, we lived in the western suburbs of Sydney. We lived at Moorebank, a little place called Anzac Village, and Dad was at the Holsworthy Army camp. And they had traditionally, I'm sure, been coalition voters. They would have voted for Menzies and PMs after him. But I think by 1972, they felt that there really needed to be a change in the country. And probably in those days, perhaps their views would have been, in terms of the calibration of the time, they would have been probably maybe a little progressive, and they wanted to see spring cleaning in the country, if that makes sense. And so, yes, my first political experience was going into a polling booth with my parents. I think it was with Dad, and seeing, him mark the ballot paper literally for Gough Whitlam, because Gough was our local federal member.
Right.
And the other part of the story was that Dad had, as the commanding officer of the 5th Battalion out at Holsworthy, given that Gough was the local member, he'd actually invited Gough to come and speak to the officers of his battalion about in his role as the local member, but also about the defence policy of the opposition at the time. And Dad got into a lot of trouble about that, which I think he was always a bit outraged, because it was, to invite the local member of parliament is something that is quite, I think, appropriate and normal. And I've seen it happen many times since in my army career. So, that's part of it. And by the way, when Gough won, my late mother actually applied to be his advisor for the status of women. So how about that? Yeah. By 1974, they decided that they had, and the country had made a huge mistake. That's how bad, by the way, for the viewers, that's how bad the Whitlam government actually was. So people who'd actually supported him within 2 years thought that it was a terrible, terrible mess where the country was going. And they joined the Liberal Party, and Dad then ended up standing as a Liberal candidate and winning in 75.
Yeah. And so was it the chaos and poor administration of the Whitlam government which was the real issue, or was it because there was ultimately some base political program, social liberalism to a certain extent, which sounds like attracted some of your parents, but also an economic liberalism as well. I think people forget, right? Whitlam was the one who introduced, first of all, well before Hawke and Keating, 30% tariff reductions in Australia. And so it wasn't that which ended up changing your parents' minds. It was what the chaos that sort of.
I think it was chaos, and Queensland viewers will smile a bit at this because I always had laid at my feet, he did too much too quickly. Well, I think Whitlam did far too much too quickly, and it was very radical for its day, and he dramatically increased government expenditure, and he had a range of programs that required to be funded, and very quickly he got the economy into a huge mess. But it's interesting you raised the tariffs because, Stan, I know you're really interested in that. The tariffs wouldn't have been something that I think they would have really thought about at the time, but I can tell they sure as hell did when Dad became the federal member for the Northern Tasmanian seat of Bass. He was elected in July 75, so Fraser was in opposition. In November of that year, there was the dismissal and then the election in December where Fraser won, and Dad went into the outer ministry. But the thing was, Launceston had a huge textile industry.
Yeah,
it was a big part of the economy in the north of the state, and obviously helped many wool growers and the like. And there was the big Coates Payton's woolen mills, for example. That all just disappeared overnight. It was decimated. So when he was then a federal member in the Fraser government, dealing with the aftershocks of the dismantling of the tariff wall was a big part of what he had to do. And there were all these people who lost their jobs. These companies went out of business. They just shut up shop, and there are a whole lot of unemployed people who had to be retrained and reskilled and found new employment. But Launceston did it tough for quite a few years. I'd say it took, at least 8 to 10 years before it really started to get over that.
I've been to Launceston. Don't have quite the rust belts that you see in other, the US and in parts of Europe, but you can still see the warehouses. Once were factories, you can certainly see how it would have been a neat industrial town too, because it has the river flowing through it, and you can see how with the primary produce they would have used that surplus to turn it into sort of with the mill and everything else, and eventually turn it into
you come down the hill on the bypass road into the heart of Launceston, and it's quite a spectacular view as you come down, because the city's down in the valley, as you'll recall. And then as you look to the left, as you're getting down to the lower parts of the hill, that's where the old Coates Payton's factory is still there today. It's been repurposed. I think there's some there's a medical centre in there, for example. But it really knocked the place around.
Yeah. But you still think, though, maybe it was done too fast, too soon. But you still think the overall removing the tariff wall that Australia had developed under since Federation until sort of Gough Whitlam's time, you still think that was ultimately a good move, right? Like none of that.
It is. Yeah, it hasn't. I think. I mean, what was the situation back then? Well, I can't give anybody watching this podcast any sort of relative figures, but back then, apparel was expensive. So, footwear, socks, shirts, jumpers, what you name it, it was far more expensive in a relative sense than today. And if we take socks, people used to darn their socks in this country because socks were expensive. So, the tariff wall protected the industry, but it did in true economic theory says, it imposed a cost on all of us. And, I think today we benefit, in terms of buying the basics through the removal of those tariffs. But it is problematic, and I welcome having the debate about it, because, black and white is never the answer. I think there's got to be a bit of pragmatism along the way. And if we have the debate today, though, like if you want to get straight into this, I mean, suppose we talk about any sort of manufacturing today. My problem with going back to some sort of tariff protection is that it doesn't deal with fundamental problems that need to be dealt with first. So, we've got this crazy push to net zero and renewables, and as a result, electricity prices have gone through the roof. We won't properly allow the exploitation of our plentiful fossil fuel resources, coal and particularly gas, so energy costs are artificially high. We've got a Labor government that have just taken us back to the 1970s with terrible industrial relations changes, which haven't begun to bite yet, but by gosh, they're going to be bad for Australia. And it's very hard to get approvals for any sort of project. So the idea of putting a tariff wall in to, say, foster a new industry sector or whatever, to rebuild manufacturing, I think immediately what's really going on, well, I'd say it is actually going to impose costs on the community, and they're costs that perhaps are too high or needless when we haven't fixed these other things. So, I think though, sorry, you go.
Nevertheless, though, right, whether we like it or not, the United States, first of all under Trump, has introduced a tariff regime, a very sophisticated tariff regime. Anyone who thinks that this is just mindless throwing stuff at a wall needs to really read Robert Lighthizer, who was Trump's United States trade representative. He knows, former partner at Skadden Arps. He's a very sophisticated guy, knows this stuff backwards. So they have imposed, building up a new tariff wall. Trump, Biden has, and Kamala have maintained that. And the proposals, if it was to be a second Trump term, are to not only increase tariffs on China dramatically, and also specific products like EV vehicles, but to have effectively a broad-based tariff regime, surrounding the United States of at least 10%. So that's a major ally, someone which we have close cultural affinity and all the rest of it. And I guess I hear the response that you have, which is, look, don't think about tariffs. We need to fix our energy and everything else first. But nuclear will help us provide cheap energy, and that will help us, to the extent it's possible, reboot our manufacturing sector. But the United States has nuclear, right? It has a lot more flexible labour market than we do, and probably will ever be able to do. It has a cheaper energy generally, and yet it has been deindustrialized. Like there's been a massive social cost. J.D. Vance's autobiography goes through part of that. There are strategic problems by outsourcing so much of your industrial base to geopolitical competitors. And if they're doing that, why doesn't it make sense for us to think about doing something along the same lines?
Well, look, let's just examine the United States for a second. I certainly agree with you that the removal of the tariffs and the protection they provided have been catastrophic for parts of the United States, the Midwest, the so-called Rust Belt. And I watch very closely and with great interest to what Trump and J.D. Vance have said about this. I mean, NAFTA, I think, had a really huge impact. It's interesting that the Democrats brought it in, of course. Clinton was the big one with that. And the union movement, by the way, in the States at the time were, fairly fierce opponents of that. It's quite interesting how it actually happened. But the thing about the difference is, though, in a lot of ways, is that Australia far more is the quarry and the farm, and our economy has relied less on manufacturing. And yes, it's been hollowed out as well, but you can't say it's to the same devastating impact. I mean, I talked about Launceston, but Launceston's not like a Midwest Rust Belt town. It's not like it's not like say a Detroit, which is it's quite spectacular what's happened there in a bad way. So Australia's had the benefit of the export resources sector to generate an income in the world and provide other employment. I think your argument comes in when you start to really look at the sort of vulnerability we have in our supply chains. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense going on at the moment about what's causing the shortage of these saline IV supplies for hospitals, and they are manufactured here. But why have we got a shortage? During COVID, we saw that there's a whole lot of vital medical supplies that we don't make here. And so I suppose there are arguments there from a defence strategic sort of point of view. I mean, another one I think is really important is the supply of motor fuel and avgas and the like. I mean, we now have a supply chain reliant on those ships turning up from the refineries in Singapore, as I understand it, regular intervals. We don't have stocks on shore, and our refineries are essentially have been progressively shutting down. So that's where you get into that's Dan where I think you get into the territory where you can have arguments about sort of you do need to ensure your sovereign interests are protected.
I've put this to other people. I mean, there is more of acceptance now that for security reasons in narrow tailored sectors that there should be, we can't engage in an open trade and investment regime necessarily. And so people get very excited about critical minerals or quantum computing or particular building submarines in Tasmania and stuff. And the issue with that, which is called, I think, the walled garden approach, where you allow an open market, but you just focus on these things, is that there's a lot of parts of industry, things that we rely on. You mentioned fuel and everything else, but I was preparing for this. I was looking for a light bulb. Where's the light bulb come from, or where's the screw come from, or where do my shirts and my shoes and everything else? And yes, it is possible to outsource them to third world jurisdictions where you can profit from the cheap labor, but there is a cost to that, and it's not necessarily an economic cost. Yes, you don't darn your socks in Launceston anymore, but you lose the capacity to make socks and socks and fish hooks and all sorts of books and other things that are necessary for economic sovereignty, to have control of your own destiny to a certain degree. Now that can be, we're not North Korea, we're not it's not engage. The aim is not to engage in some sort of complete self-sufficiency. We'll always need to import things, including raw materials. I don't think we produce any rubber, for example, ourselves. We'd have to always import that. You can't. But the idea, look, we've had a unique situation in Australia because unlike the US and Europe, we have a current account surplus with China. We've been deindustrialized like those guys, probably more, but because of our mineral riches, we've in theory we've prospered, right? Except you would think we've prospered, except we have $1 trillion deficit. We have incredibly overpriced housing, which no young people can kind of afford. We have all these other ills. Which
Dan, by the way, all these things. When you start going to this stuff, I'll just shoot back at you. All government created. They're victim. Well, government created, but as a response to, I suppose, community sentiment in some ways, and so we're getting what we actually almost asked the politicians to do, or the politicians didn't have the courage to actually explain the facts of life to us. And I'd be happy to pick apart a whole range of things here. I mean, I think we have really. I'm a free trade person fundamentally. Yeah. I'm a member of the Libertarian Party, and I believe I think we've really prospered from free trade. I think the rubber hits the road, though, that assists your argument is when you suddenly wake up and go, oh, hang on, maybe we're not going to have, enduring world peace. And at that point, that's when you really go, oh, there's an SHIT moment, and you think maybe you've become very, very vulnerable in various things.
Isn't the utopian sort of element of free trade? Look, if everyone, I believe in free trade from Townsville to Tamworth to Tarcoola, right? Within a particular entity, there should be no barriers to trade within a common nation and people, right? And the closer people are to you, like New Zealanders, we can have much closer trading relations. But free trade doesn't sort of really appreciate that nations have interests, and those interests change over time, and that not the people you're trading with aren't always friendly. The well-worn example I use is it wouldn't have made sense for Athens to have Persia produce all its ships, right? And yet I remember distinctly, this Australia Day lunch in Hong Kong where Peter Costello was, regaling the troops, saying, I find it annoying, these Americans, they're always, these congressmen, they're always saying that we think that China's going to produce all our cars. And I don't, I'm a market believer. It shouldn't matter whether China produce all America's cars. And I think, well, hang on, man. That's unrealistic.
But why don't we talk about what it would take to get industry going in this country? And I think you see, I don't know that we need tariffs to actually have manufacturing. It starts at a very base level, which is, well, let's just look at that. It's fascinating that at the moment in this country, the biggest job creation is in the care sector. Yeah. And we're seeing the recent unemployment numbers reflect that, most of the jobs being created are actually ultimately backed by the government. So we're pumping money, the Labor Party are pumping money into essentially, that care sector, whether it be childcare, whether it be NDIS funding and the like. And, sort of everyone's going, oh, wow, look, there's the economy's so robust. Well, that's just a little example of the problems in this country that governments create, because it is giving us, for example, in this situation, inflation. But fundamentally, Australia has a problem, and the problem is this: that business is not encouraged, business is not celebrated. I'm talking about real business. We have some large enterprises which are actually not that big in an international scale, run by corporate bureaucrats, and our SME sector sort of survive in the background and actually have fairly profitable businesses, but the whole framework isn't set up to allow them to grow. The tax law is wrong, the IR law is wrong, I talked about approvals, but the ethos is wrong. There is a problem in this country with the ethos. People don't think about going into business. They think about going into, like our best and brightest, they want to become, with greatest respect to you, a member of the legal profession, they want to be a lawyer. They want to be an accountant, or they want to go and be a human rights lawyer. They want to work for the public service.
I'm as critical of the legal profession, everything else is probably you are. But
so this is a problem. Whereas in the United States, I venture to suggest, historically far more of the people graduating or just from colleges or even from the technical and trade sort of schools are thinking, I want to do my own thing, I want to be my own boss. I'm employing a young intern in my business in the next few weeks. So I got onto the Fair Work website and I checked out what I had to do. So I'm paying a 19-year-old with no experience who hasn't finished from uni. I've got to pay him as a casual. I'm pretty sure I've got this right, $26 something an hour, plus 11.5% super. And, he's not going to, with the greatest respect to this person, he's not going to generate any value for some time. It's going to cost me. And if I keep him for more than 9 to 12 months, the rules now say, well, why didn't you offer him a permanent job? So this is just, this country's insane. It is insane. So So,
yeah,
and I'm sick, Dan. I'm sick to death of being lectured by Labor politicians who talk about what it takes to run a business. But equally, I'm pissed off with the coalition who were bleating in the last 48 hours about why doesn't small business back me? Well, I'd love to talk to Susan Ley face to face, and I can give her a dozen reasons of the things that their government did in the last 8 or 9 years prior to losing office, where they tied small and medium-sized businesses up and more red tape. I mean, come on, that's the problem. We can build things here. We can make things here. But if we have tariff walls, I actually don't think we won't get efficient, well-produced, world-class products. I mean, we'll encourage sloth and ineptitude.
Yeah, but Campbell, it's almost like the situation where the bipartisan consensus on trade has not changed since the sort of 80s, late 90s, right? Everyone, apart from fringe political people, say, yeah, zero tariffs, or close to zero tariffs, or at least that should be the ideal. Isn't the overregulation of Australia and the massive, government spending on soaking up people engaged in either universities or NDIS, or isn't that a response? Because all the other industries and stuff that we used to have that used to employ the trade, people involved we used to work with their hands, have been offshored. So all that's left is sort of a management class here, lawyers, like you said, accountants, all the rest of it, and people who are either involved in real estate, mining, or financial services, a bit of software here and there. Everything else, all the other sort of more substantial, broader ecosystem that we used to have in Australia has been sent offshore. And as a result, you no longer have the people in the public service with those practical skills of understanding how things actually work and how things are produced. What I'm getting at is we have this much celebrated Hawke-Keating Howard kind of consensus. Cannot speak ill of it, and yet aren't the consequences of it? It's certainly not. What we're dealing with now is not what we were sold in the end, right? We were sold that, I'm sure at the time we were sold that manufacturing would increase, that we would become, much more. I don't know, we wouldn't have $1 trillion worth of debt. How much of that is a consequence of what actually happened rather than the ethos?
Why don't we talk about what we got? Well, I think we've benefited from the point of view if we've got affordable clothing, we've got affordable motor cars, we've got affordable furniture, we've got affordable gadgets for our homes, whether it be sort of sound systems, and the TVs are fantastic. So we've got all that, but I think it's an interesting point that you're putting up, that that perhaps the government spending has expanded to fill that void, but I don't know if I quite agree to that extent. I think it's because. I think that's happened is because what we're really good at is digging this stuff out of the ground and setting off overseas. What we're really good at is growing crops with almost no rain. Our farmers are just so innovative, and I think we do logistics really well, supply chain management, whether it be bulk or containerized freight, etc. I think we do that quite well. But I think because we have been so wealthy, we can afford these amazing social programs like, assistance for childcare and aged care, and indeed the NDIS, which is just a monster of a social program.
Are we really wealthier? Because look, the middle class in the United States, deindustrialization is one thing, and I guess it would be fine if the middle class were preserved. But it hasn't been. The middle class in the United States have also been decimated. You can't have a democratic, society that respects property if you don't have white, broad-based people who own property. I mean, that's just and that's something that people actually pride away.
It's coming here.
It is coming here, right? And it's and so what extent? And we have we're in an anomalous situation. It's part of why I think this sort of Nat Connie thing hasn't really properly emerged here like it has in the United States and in Europe, because we've been blessed with this sort of China boom, which is still in theory ongoing. But even with the China boom, yes, maybe our socks have got cheaper, but our houses have gone through the roof. I mean, we've financialized the economy, so that, which is a key metric of being able to join the middle class. Our kids, at least in the capital cities, have vanishingly smaller ability to actually.
Let's unpick the housing thing. The housing crisis is because, there's a range of reasons for that. So let's just start with the way young people are taxed. And I really despair about this. We had a debate about these tax cuts in the last few years, which has been the most disgraceful, preposterous sort of debate I think I've seen. Anybody, any young professional person who's out from uni after about 5 years is earning over now effectively a package of over $100,000. So someone with about 5 or 6 years experience is immediately into the second highest tax bracket, second from the top. Now, tax is an issue. These people are trying to save for a home, and yet because of this sort of stupid mantra, which the Labor Party were allowed to get away with by the journalists, young people trying to find their first home are actually being taxed far higher than they were by my generation 30, 35 years ago. It really gets me upset. And particularly then there are ones who are paying, these sort of university HECS debts back as well. So they're paying relatively higher tax. So that makes it harder to save for a deposit. So in terms of then let's look at some reasons then for the cost of housing. I think you alluded to it. Housing has become, it's essentially playing the residential housing game is an investment asset class. And, the Greens and some members of the Labor Party bleat on about negative gearing and capital gains tax exemption. I'll give you a different reason. It's because of bloody regulation, Dan. It's because in this country, the financial services regulation from those good folk over at ASIC, backed by the people in Treasury who are clueless when it comes to what this is really doing to the country, is actually saying, look here, if you want to go and find an asset class that everybody can invest in, and there are relatively few rules, it's actually residential property. But if you want to invest in shares or Bitcoin or sort of mortgage-backed, lending, or you want to invest in a real estate investment trust, what does that come with? Well, that comes with regulation and red tape, which is well-intentioned, but has the opposite effect. It makes it less interesting to people to invest in. It makes it more complex for people to invest in. Add a layer of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, know your customer red tape. So just to actually invest in an offering, you've got to spend an hour filling out an application form. You've got to provide your passport and your driver's license, and it goes on and on and on. What I'm saying is residential real estate for a whole lot of people who are lucky enough to have the money, have the foot on the escalator, it's easy. So there aren't the same rules and constraints. So people people trade real estate. So there's another thing. There's another thing. What I'm saying, the authorities have made it a monopoly playing piece. Yeah. But then you get into all these other things like, the way that councils take so long to approve stuff, and state governments have essentially allowed them to do that. You've got the CFMEU tax, which means that apartments cost 25 to 30% more than they should. You've got stamp duty, which is being charged by state governments propping up their poor financial management. You've got the GST, which is then being imposed on the new stock on top of it all. It just goes on and on and on. Then you've got the building. You've got finish this thought. Building regulations. You have these little secretive groups who meet states come together, who meet behind closed doors, who keep changing the building code, so that once upon a time there were no smoke. Example, once upon a time there were no smoke detectors. Then we had to have smoke detectors. Then we had to have a different type of smoke detector because it wasn't good enough. Then we had to hardwire the smoke detectors in.
Mm. Yeah,
it's that plus that disability access. What I got the
I heard about it.
Like,
new building code and everything
we have done it to ourselves because the government pull fences. You got to have a pull fence.
So it's ironically, we have a situation where, again, one of the much lauded elements of the Hawke-Keating era was the floating of the dollar and the deregulation of the financial system, right?
Yep.
And yet we have an ironic situation where it was harder to get credit back in Menzies' day, but more young people owned houses than we do now. And we have, a deregulated, in theory, financial sector, but you have all these little minute things that have come into play, and less people own houses. And we have many people have massive amounts of credit card debt and are swimming in debt. And so, you got to think, I'll just park this thought. What was that trying to achieve? But the one thing I want to mention
it is regulation. Honestly, it's layer upon layer of regulation, in insidious tentacles of regulation that flow through everything in this country that actually corrupt, corrupt markets.
Right. But okay, so the one thing you didn't mention when you're talking about the housing market, and I must say it's very typical when you read a lot of op-eds, it's immigration. No one.
I'm happy. Well, I think it's got a huge amount to do with it at the moment. But we had a situation where house prices were going up fast, over the last few decades. I mean, they've really, they were going up prior to COVID. They'd gone up prior to COVID, and what's happened since COVID. So I think it's played a huge. It has created a huge impact on. On things in the last 2 years. But by the way, the other thing we get, what is the response of a whole lot of people in the world of politics? You've got the Greens, and again, members of the Labor Party, and social policy groups like QCOS in Queensland or ACOS. We've got to have rent control. You've got discredited policies, discredited 60, 70 years ago, things that will actually hurt renters. And are hurting renters down in, say, Victoria right now. Victoria is probably ahead of the race, and it's just.
But the Greens do not. There are elements that might, but certainly the elected representatives, they are not in favour of cutting immigration. In fact, they're in favour of boosting all sorts of immigration, all sorts of unsavoury places, and that's but the coalition also, despite recent suggestions that they might cut some of it, are also still in favour of effectively what I would call mass immigration. And that's been the bipartisan Hawke, Keating Howard kind of consensus as well. A non-discriminately mass immigration program since the 80s. And so, the UK election recently happened. One of the major issues I think everyone realises for the Tories almost being wiped out was that they just blew the lid off the numbers that were coming in with a very short period of time. Albanese and has done the same here. Konstantin Kisin, who's a podcaster in the UK, right? He recently travelled to Australia, and he said that in many ways, travelling to Australia from Britain feels like a journey 10 years into the past. In previous decades, this would read like a hack joke meant to paint Aussies as provincial, unsophisticated people. But today it is both a compliment and a warning.
I saw that.
Yeah, and it made me think that sort of dumb joke that Southerners, who I'm very used to use, when traveling to Queensland, remember to turn your clock back an hour another 25 years, right? So putting those two together, I'm thinking, well, look, Queensland is actually, we have a bit more protection than other parts of Australia. So my question to you, ex-Premier of Queensland, is how do we stop what is happening in the UK from happening in Australia and our state?
Okay. Yeah, right. Well, okay. So I'm a supporter of a big Australia, right? So I don't mind a large immigration program, but it's got to be a planned immigration program, and it's got to be planned at multiple levels. So in terms of local government and state government, there's a need to plan for the growth of our cities and towns and for infrastructure. And also then the federal government needs to fund them appropriately. So, I used to talk about this when I was in local government and as a state politician, but it's like every new immigrant that comes into the country comes with two things. They come with a check in a figurative sense and an invoice. The check, the federal government collects because they ultimately get the revenue from that new citizen. The invoice is presented to the state and local governments because they've got to pay the bills. They've got to pay for that infrastructure through their budgets. And that's the great rort for the feds because, they get the economic growth and that, their budgets get boosted and become bigger, but they don't pass on what's required to deal with that. Then there's the issue, which I really think you want to get to, which is this issue about the sort of program. We want to avoid the problems in the UK and indeed Europe. It has to be a selective immigration program. I think we need to be very careful about who we let in. I think it's outrageous at the moment that we are bringing in several thousand people from Gaza and, we haven't properly checked, their credentials and their allegiances. And, I personally don't feel the need to bring those people in when their Arab neighbours won't actually bring them in. I think if people do come in, I don't mind people from other religions and of course and races being here. But what I really say is, I want. It's almost like there needs to be. There's a citizenship oath. I'm looking with absolute dismay at statements by people who are anti-Semitic, who are quite radical in the Muslim faith, particularly we're seeing it in Sydney and Melbourne, who are saying things that are inconsistent with their citizenship vow. I can quote the citizen vow. I've delivered so many citizenship ceremonies, and it's about from this time forth, under God, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I obey, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. And some of these people don't get it, and they should be stripped of their citizenship and sent back on the next plane.
But it doesn't work that way, right? You can't.
Well, it should. It should work that way. That's the thing, and. If I was still Premier, I'd be drawing a line in the sand in the national debate and saying, we'll welcome you from around the world. We're happy to have a multicultural country. We're going to make it work. And the way we make it work is, if you step out of line against our values, we will deal with you. We will criticise you, we'll come down on you, and we won't cop, this sort of nonsense we've seen.
What do you think, though? Look, two things. What's an appropriate annual intake? Because Jacob Rees-Mogg recently in the UK, he said after leaving office, of course, that we should be talking about an immigration program not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the tens of thousands, and that's in the UK, which is a bigger population. What's wrong with the tens of thousands in Australia rather than?
Well, I think we can do more than that, but again, it's got to be planned and it's got to be administered, and it's not by children, not by naive idiots. It's got to be run by grown-ups who are prepared to be tough about it. And it's like, you come here if we let you in, and this is the standard that applies, and this is what this country is about, and we won't cop people disrupting the social fabric and the values of Australia. And it's like, that's what we're seeing.
When you have big numbers, let's call it 160,000, 65,000, which I think is Dutton's new number. That's still, population of almost Townsville a year. And I've seen the Brisbane City Council planning, and very sophisticated, probably best in Australia. But when you have such a large group of people, it's so much harder to work out what they will do and where they will live in a city. So that back in the day, when you had people draftsmen with pens and papers, working out where Waterworks Road would go, it was much an easier kind of process for them to do. Right, that's the first point. And they do impose a cost on, they push pressure on housing, even though it should be better to start a business and own a house and sort of build and do everything else. But secondly, and this is the other non-economic cost, right? There is concerns about social cohesion and the rest of it. We worry about anti-Semitism and other types of things, but it's not as though that's sort of some sort of like intellectual error. If you're importing such a large number of people, there will be a portion of those who come from societies who have long-standing ethnic animosity towards whatever Israel or other types of countries. And so it's sort of a little bit unrealistic. While we have incredible assimilative power, Australia, right? It's an attractive place and culture, and people can assimilate here. When you have such large numbers, you push it to the limit, to breaking point. Whereas if you had a much smaller number, tailored one, you could select the absolute best. And if people, you would have a much higher quality of immigrant, and you wouldn't, we at the moment, our society, legacy of the Hawke Howard era, we are an immigration dependent for growth. That's why Treasury freak out whenever anyone suggests any kind of reduction in the tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. Everyone goes, oh my God, that would be immediate recession for us. But, we're a nation. There needs to be a thoughtful process about, from a first principles basis, why do we have any immigrants at all, right? I'm in favour of
I started. Yeah. Well, look, we've been taking too many in the last. We've been taking too many in the last few years, right? The last 2-3 years, we've taken far too many. That's clear. But in terms of can we absorb more people? I think we can. Again, it comes down to planning. And I point to the example post-World War II through to say, when I was born in 1963, so that was only an 18-year period, we massively changed Australia, and it didn't go backwards. I think it went forward. And in those days, it was the 10-pound POMs, isn't that what they called them? Was it 5 pounds anyway? We brought in all these Brits. We brought in lots of people from Italy, lots of people in from Greece. There's a huge waves that came in. And I think, the country, sort of went ahead in leaps and bounds. So it's about how we plan the program. It's about the mix, the numbers of the people we bring in. I mean, for example, and I'm saying this, I'll share this with your viewers. I was Honorary Indian of the Year in Queensland for 3 years running. I'm very proud of that. I'm very fond of people who've come from the Indian subcontinent. I think they've got, I'm just playing favourites here. I love them for a whole range of reasons. I love them because I think they're particularly business focused, and I've always reflected on the fact that we don't have enough people who want to be in business. I love the fact that they have a certain affinity to British traditions, and they understand democracy. They have the free press in India. They not that I'm a cricket tragic at all, but they love their cricket. In fact, when you go as a politician, Australian politician, to India, the first thing they want to talk about is about the cricket and what's been going on. So that's a group, I think, that I think they've done wonderful things in terms of their contribution.
Look, I have family.
So
I have family.
It is about the mix and the numbers and the relativities between groups, and that has to be. I know people would scream at us probably watching this. The left would scream at us, but I think it has to. You've got to curate that. Okay, it's the overall numbers. So I'm sort of agreeing that it can't be a free for all, but I think then how you bring people in and their skill sets, I think that has to be carefully curated.
Yeah, but Campbell, the UK has taken disproportionately large numbers of people from the Indian subcontinent.
I've lost audio from you, mate.
What's that?
I've lost audio from you.
Now
it's come back. Yeah,
Okay.
just came back.
Sorry, just we lost audio. But the UK, for example, has taken a larger proportion of people from the Indian subcontinent than we have. They understand, there's much more familiarity with India, I think, there than whereas we're much more familiar with China stuff. But there are problems there, and because and at least part of that has got to do with ethnic tensions of different religions and the rest of it, right? And I noticed the other day when you were talking about the UK on Twitter, you quoted John Milton and the famous sort of words about free speech in the UK, well, generally. But do you think it's possible to have free speech in a democratic, multicultural society? I mean, because isn't there a difference between? Isn't there a difference? Isn't there a difference?
I think there just has to be full stop.
But isn't there a difference though between, say, well, in theory that Speaker's Corner in the UK, people can get up and say whatever they like, and there's been a long tradition of that. But then there's, if you're a colonial administrator in Baluchistan or the Indian subcontinent somewhere traditionally, you might very well think that yes, there might be a need in order to maintain social peace amongst a rest of ethnic population, that we need to just sacrifice a bit of that in order to maintain stability. And isn't it almost that's what's going on in the UK? There's an ethnic conflict of some description going on there, or at least tensions going on there. And the UK authorities are stepping in like the old colonial administrators in Calcutta, and
but they're not. But they're not. But so you've with the greatest respect, perhaps you've missed the point of what's going on over there. The point is this: that there are particular ethnic groups running down the street, shouting out slogans that are anti-Semitic, and engaging in violent acts themselves, who are treated with kid gloves. Then there are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Catholics who are then engaging in violent demonstrations or riots themselves, who are being absolutely pulverised by the government. And there's it's the two-tiered policing, which is real. It is a double standard which will rip the country apart. What I'm saying is that without fear, without favour, this is the way we do it here. This is the standard. And if you step out of line, then you will be in trouble with the law. Okay. And so what we've seen in this country, I'm afraid, verges on some of that. It hasn't been anywhere near as bad, but we've seen hate speech, real hate speech, by certain religious figures at mosques in Sydney, that, in my opinion, trip over the line, and it hasn't been dealt with. We're seeing lots of hand wringing in this country, where we're seeing protests and action that everyone's going, that's anti-Semitic. What's happened? We saw, if we go back prior to COVID, we had it was a number of young people at QUT who got into a world of trouble for some comments that they put on social media about a space that was made available exclusively to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, right? They were in a world of trouble. They hauled before the human rights mod. Where are they when this is going on? It's that double standard that causes division and resentment. If we're going to have human rights laws, if we're going to have hate speech laws, then they have to be administered, without reference to people's race or religion. They have to be totally impartially administered, and they're not. But in the UK right now, we're seeing a stark example of that. We really, really are. But back to your point, I believe free speech is possible, and indeed it's mandatory. And where it tips across the line is there's those old tests about, a famous court case about screaming fire in a crowded theatre and causing a crush. Well, here it's example, and I'm a huge fan of the nation of Israel. I support them 100%. If someone stands up and says, I don't agree with Israel. I don't agree with their policies. I think they need to stop the war. Blah blah blah. Tick tick tick. I think the IDF aren't observing the rules of war. Tick. That's all okay. I think they're wrong, but you can say that. But going further and starting to say, well, there should be go and kill Jews in Australia or hurt them, or the Israeli nation should be eliminated from the earth. That's going too far.
Those restrictions, incitement to violence, have always existed under English common law. We built an additional framework on top of that, so that Australia was probably the safest place in the 20th century to be a Jew, right? In the world, there's no real history of anti-Semitism in Australia, and yet it's been because of the composition of our immigration program that has developed here, and particular politicians have sought to capture that constituency by reflecting their views and pushing them up, or at least been under pressure to adjust their previous views. And I can think of federal ministers and other people in that space. But what has happened, right, is from the days of Gough Whitlam, once you start bringing in large numbers, you sort of forced at least you're not forced to do anything. But what has happened is that there's been an anti-discrimination regime that's been placed on top of the traditional common law, which has included restrictions on freedom of speech, and that has been used, if people making comments like Andrew Bolt back in the day, the much heralded court case he was involved in. But now they're upping it even further, so that it's not just incitement to violence against Jews or the like. It's well beyond that. And I take your point about the inconsistent application of those laws. There's no way that it's not credible that the police they will come down like a ton of bricks on someone who makes some sort of slightly off remark online, but they're not policing the mosques of Western Sydney to work out what. No, well,
look, if you and I were to say something offensive in this podcast, they would be it'd be all over the media, the mainstream media, and they'd be at the door, pressing charges, and that is wrong, and they're bad laws anyway. I go back to free speech is under threat. We can have and must have free speech in this society, and they have lost the plot totally. I'm glad you noticed the stuff I put on about Milton from 380 years ago. And by the way, Dan, and listeners might be interested in this, I'm just reading a book about London in the 1600s, and it was the time of the Civil War. They, against the Royalists versus the Roundheads and that. And London in those days had a huge involvement, people in the community with the public debate, and there were pamphlets, there were newspapers, there were notices hammered onto walls, and there was misinformation in those days. The place was awash with misinformation. And what did the government try and do then? Well, the Parliament was there trying to suppress misinformation. And what happened out of that? Well, the UK evolved. The blood that was spilled, the violence that was sustained by the community. Ultimately, the conclusion was that to have free speech. And now we've seen a modern crop of politicians and administrators, public servants, who are forgetting all that, who are throwing all away, and realise that what they're doing is they're taking their country into the abyss, because people do have to be able to speak their mind, and what they're doing is
another one of these situations where, just to maybe sort of try and wrap it up, there's these classical liberal sort of axioms: free trade, free speech, freedom of movement, and all the rest of it, freedom of assembly, and that always, I think, increasingly in this world, bumping up to into certain geopolitical realities and realities regarding culture, let's call it, right? In 1600s UK, it was more or less a monocultural society. There's a book by Dan Hannon which talks about the most violent. No. Let me finish. The most violent.
I don't know about that.
The most violent real acts of warfare that occurred at that time were where was in Ireland, right? Because they were dealing with people who weren't this, who had a different type of culture. My family's from there originally, and names like Drogheda and all the rest of it, Northern Ireland, still sort of etched in the memory. But between the English themselves, there wasn't that. It was the same type of ethnic group, and so that's why in Japan you have freedom of speech. South Korea you have freedom of speech, whereas in countries which are much more complex ethnically, it seems to be that a trade-off is made between trying to keep the peace and restricting what you can say. And I worry that in Australia and the UK, that's the sort of trade-off that we're also going through as well. Likewise, right? Classical free trade, there shouldn't be any restrictions on who you can trade with. But when you're trading with, it does matter who you're trading with. It doesn't matter what their interests are. It doesn't matter where they're going. And you can't it's not fixed in time. These sort of, what may have made sense in the 80s needs to be readjusted to take into account.
Well, just going back, I want to pick you up on what you asserted about, yes, they were all English, but they were completely divided. So they were. It was a very polarized society. There were just simplicity at the beginning. There were Protestants and Catholics. There was you had Charles.
Different denominations of Protestantism, really, like in the
I was
Puritan
going to say they then splintered. The Protestant movement splintered, if I can put it like that. But like this was, they might as well have been, Bulgarians or or Chinese who were there. That's how differently. No, they were like, it was,
I just think the English
great suspicion, great enmity.
I won't keep you long, but the English-speaking world, we don't really understand ethnic conflict that well, because the closest we see Northern Ireland and we think, yeah, that's an intractable problem, two groups of people, you can't offer them tax breaks and solve the issue. Whereas, I guess we understand South Africa a little bit and America to some extent, although Black Americans speak English and largely have the same religion, and they just happen to be a different kind of background. And they've had their challenges over the years, they're right. Whereas in Northern Ireland, it's just people of the same stock, if you want to use that term, speak the same language, just happen to have a different type of, religion to within.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But that sectarianism is what was there in 1642 in London. But
the differences between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland compared to the difference in different groups who come across to Australia now, I just don't think we appreciate the difference. I think I always say we're kind of culturally careless. We don't appreciate the differences and how we just assume because we're used to it. Like, it doesn't care, we don't think about it. We're in the same way that Eastern Europeans or people in Africa or some continent think about those things and realize there are real challenges to sort of be dealt with as best you can.
But if enmity surely though is the core thing here. It's the enmity between groups. And yes, I take your point. I think the cultural framework of a Chinese or an Indian or an Arab immigrant to this country, their cultural framework is quite different to a white Anglo-Saxon. But in terms of the issue, you're talking free speech and talking about trying to make a point about sort of free speech back in the 1640s. I talk, but the enmity that is what the issue was there, and I don't think it's any different. Is what I'm saying. I think that's what the anti-free speech people are trying to deal with. They're trying to. They're saying we have to curtail this because otherwise we've got social discord. We've got
sometimes I think guys on the centre right, they talk about cracking down on freedom of speech, and they think the problem is purely ideological in the same way it's like the Soviets cracking down on speech in the 1970s in Russia, whereas it's somewhat of a different challenge, and the motivations are somewhat different and the solutions are somewhat different.
What are they, purer, Dan?
Well,
Look, it's coming. Well, it's coming from the left, and it's interesting. I don't know if it's true. There's been this stuff floating around. Could be misinformation about comparing the sort of the moves to shut down misinformation in the UK in a certain period of time compared to Russia recently.
Yeah. I know it's crazy.
It certainly sounds plausible.
Yeah, more people, I think, prosecuted for online statements in the UK than there have been in Russia today.
Maybe, or alternatively, perhaps the problem, mate, is that in Russia they have been cowed into sullen compliance, and they don't even bother anymore because they know they're going to be carted off.
Yeah,
that's about crime stats.
Yeah, I know you have to head, so I won't keep you too long. There is, again, just coming back to the sort of reason why I started this, there is still a difference, a big gulf emerging between the kind of new Washington consensus on trade, immigration, and foreign policy, and what the sort of Canberra consensus believes, which I would argue hasn't really changed that much, despite all the criticisms which are well taken. Hasn't changed that much since the 1980s, or indeed probably since Scott Whitlam's time. Open borders trade, mass immigration, deregulation, certainly free-flowing capital controls, and we don't change that, but we argue about different ways to alleviate the problems that have arisen from that. And we celebrate it as though it contained all the answers, and yet, you can certainly make an argument economically, socially, and everything else. We're dealing with bigger problems than we did in Launceston in the 70s, right? So that's the bigger point. Do you think there will be a reassessment in Australia on those sort of core three things going forward?
Well, here we are talking today, and I think that you're dead right that there hasn't been too much thought about this in Australia, but you're dead right again that there is actually a huge change going on in the States. And if Trump and Vance get up, absolutely, that is going to come to pass. I don't think so with Kamala. I think it would be probably business as usual, no matter what she might have said so far. I just don't believe it. But yeah, I think there will be a reappraisal coming in Australia. And, to be clear, I think probably you can't, like it'd be like standing, to try and turn back the tide to suggest that it can't or won't happen or shouldn't happen, because I think it's going to have to. Because I think we have some very significant issues that we need to deal with. We do need to build manufacturing. We talked about, say, the fuel earlier on. So I think it is going to happen, and I think it must happen. Yeah, I think you and I are quite a way apart on what the response should be. But I think we're both acknowledging, we both are totally in lockstep, I think, on the issues that have arisen.
Yeah, and I think that part of the reason why I set up this thing is that I want there to be a coherent, thoughtful framework for dealing with these things that are clearly coming down the line, rather than simply, as so often happens, as I'm sure you appreciate in politics, issue arises in the papers, knee-jerk response, adds to the problem rather than actually solves it, or it deals with it for the wrong reasons. It deals with it out of hatred or animus or this, that, and the other, or just to appease a particular economic group without sort of not tethered to any kind of broader thinking. So, mate, I really appreciate you coming on. Always thoughtful,
great fun.
Always full of energy, and I look forward to seeing how this develops going forward.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, viewers.
Appreciate it.